racial equity approach, and that's really significant, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. And we've really looked a lot at our other local government partners around the region, around the Northwest, and around the nation, really, as we took this into account. So, and then the other thing we wanted to share with you really is just how we developed this strategy, that it wasn't just something that we did on our own. And this really gets to the heart of what IEP2 is all about. So Juan Carlos is going to talk a little bit more about that. So with that, I'm going to introduce our equity program manager, who really is the mastermind behind most of this, along with our community partners, Juan Carlos Ocaña-Chíu, who's our equity program manager.
Thank you, Patty, and good afternoon. It's also nice for me to see a lot of familiar faces. I, as well as Patty, was working in the public engagement and communications field until about 2.5 years ago, when I started working in the Metro Equity Strategy program, first as a program analyst, and then eventually I was promoted to the program manager position. So what I wanted to share with you today is give you a brief overview about what the equity strategy is, and given the audience, I wanted also to talk in the two things that Patty mentioned, why we took a racial equity approach and how we engage the community in shaping our strategy, and then leaving as much time as possible for questions and answers and comments that you may have. So without much more ado, we'll get started. So I hope all of you can see the monitor. If not, Heather told me that we can always make this available online, so I'll be sending a copy to Heather as well. So what's Metro's officially known as Strategic Plan to Advance Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Well, it's an agency-wide strategy, and which utilizes racial equity approach, and wants to have a participatory evaluation and implementation model, and is also complementary to other efforts that Metro has, such as the Diversity Action Plan and a number of other plans to increase inclusion and public participation. So that's why we're under the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Metro. Why did we take a racial equity approach? I really like that graphic, that meme. I guess if you cannot read it, I'll read it for you. It says, how deep is the mud? It depends on who you ask. We all experience the same things differently. So in the United States, as I'm sure most of you know, all the different studies available show how communities of color really experience the most challenging outcomes in any measure of social well-being that you can imagine. If you look at education, if you look at housing, income, even if you look at commute time, you will see that people of color are experiencing more challenging outcomes than the white population. So that's the Portland metro area is no different than the rest of the nation in this aspect. So that's what started to focus our efforts on how should we approach equity at Metro. We considered how a number of different historical factors, such as policies and procedures, have been in place for a number of years, basically since the foundation of this country, and they have been designed sometimes purposefully, sometimes unintentionally, to really perpetuate the situation of racial disparities. So we decided that as we were doing our research on how to move forward with the equity strategy, we decided to look at racial equity as a way to get to the main, to really affect real change and more lasting and profound change, is by looking at who experiences those disparities more acutely and how can we remedy that. So the way that we are looking at changing that is by identifying what are the barriers that perpetuate these disparities, that make these outcomes possible, and then focusing on addressing those barriers and dismantling those barriers to improve equitable outcomes for all communities, especially for communities of color. So that's why we say we're focused on barriers and not service. One of the concerns and sometimes criticism we hear is, does this mean that you're only going to serve people of color? And the answer is no. We're government. We have to serve everyone, right? We cannot ignore the legal protections and the equal treatment under the law. However, we can shape things in a way that they really address the barriers that affect communities of color. For instance, one of the things that Metro Council did last year was to ban the box. Raise your hand if you're familiar with what ban the box is. Great. So for those of you who don't know, it's an effort that usually in the job applications for any public entity and a lot of nonprofits, one of the first questions you're asked is to check the box if you have been convicted of a criminal offense, and it says this doesn't mean automatic disqualification. However, what we find is that a lot of people who check the box are less likely to be hired, even if their offenses do not disqualify them for the job. So there's been a community-led movement to change that, and not to put that question on the first page, and rather to delay asking that question until after the first interview, until after the first round of people have been screened, and then of course you have to do your criminal background check and have that conversation. So in that way you also eliminate unconscious bias that, like it or not, it creeps up. Our friends in HR always say, no, we always treat everybody the same, we're really good at making that effort, but we know that unconscious bias is there because, again, it's unconscious. We're not aware of that, we just have it. So banning the box means not asking that question in the application or in the first interview and delaying that. So what that does is gives people a more equal opportunity to be hired. And studies show that organizations that ban the box tend to recruit more diverse workforce. So that's what Metro Council did. So we know that this is significant for communities of color because, once again, people of color have much higher rates of incarceration than white people. However, by banning the box, we're removing a barrier. We're not saying we're just going to do this for people of color. We're saying we're banning the box for everyone. So as a result, we're giving better opportunities to people of color, but also to anybody else who may have that conviction. So that's an example of our approach of focusing on barriers and not on service. Why is racial equity important? Also because it leads to more prosperity. The research shows that the regions where there is less racial disparities are also the regions that are better primed for economic growth. Dr. Manuel Pastor from USC has written a number of books and studies, and he's come to Portland in the past to talk about how equity is indeed the superior growth model and how more equitable regions are also better economic performance. So we think that it's not just the right thing to do, it's the practical thing to do. So what's in our racial equity strategy? We have the document that I'll leave the link later on at the end of the presentation where you can find it online. But just to give you the very quick rundown, it's a strategy that includes 5 long-term goals. And the first one is for Metro to convene and support regional partners to advance racial equity. The second goal is to meaningfully engage communities of color, which is something near and dear to all of us here. Also to hire, train, and promote a racially diverse workforce. Next is to create safe and welcoming environments, services, programs, and destinations for people of color. And also the last goal is that Metro's resource allocation advances racial equity. So one thing you will notice is that these are very broad goals, and they're also for the things that all of Metro does. These are common elements to all Metro departments and venues, because we all hire people, we all engage the community in one way or another, we all offer services and destinations and allocate resources, we buy services, we buy goods, and we also engage with our community partners. What it's not included here, which I'll touch on later on, are things more specific to each department, and that's something that we're currently working on. So within those 5 goals, we also have 15 5-year objectives. So we think that the goals are long-term. We don't expect to achieve those goals within 5 years. We think they're more like 25, 30 plus years. But we started with objectives within each of those goals, roughly 3 objectives per goal that we believe are achievable within that time framework of 5 years. And within those objectives, there are 77 action items organized by annually, by the things that we want to accomplish every year. So this plan was approved by Metro Council on June 23rd of this year. So it's been on the books for less than 6 months. And since its approval, we've been diligently working on implementing all of our first year actions. And Patty led our one of retreat recently of our team, and we were very happy to realize that we're all working on 100% of those action items. Perhaps not on the same schedule where we want it to be, but making pretty good progress. Those goals are really the foundation for what we want to achieve in the next 4 years. The one goal that I mentioned and that I wanted to stress was that we're working with 4 of our 14 departments right now to create their own department-specific action plans. And again, because the overall strategy was built for things that are common to all of Metro, so now we want to concentrate on those 4 departments and help them write racial equity action items for their specific things. And the 4 departments that you can see there, or 3 departments in a venue to get more specific, are some of the most iconic at Metro. So we have our Parks and Nature department that is working on their own racial equity plan. They actually have been pioneering a number of activities, and so they're kind of a little bit ahead of the rest. Same as our Property and Environmental Services department that handles the solid waste system in the region. They're also working on that. Planning and Development, which does some of the things that Metro is best known for, such as managing the urban growth boundary and our long-term transportation planning. They're part of this cohort. And also the Oregon Zoo, which is the largest visitor destination in the state of Oregon, the one that receives the largest group of visitors, I should say. So we're working with those departments to really create their own plans, and we're making a lot of progress. Sometimes you make some progress and you slide back a little, but that's the nature of the work. We're conscious that this is a long game. You know, it's not something we're going to achieve right away, and we continue with that. Also in the plan, something to note is we have a racial equity guidance questionnaire, which is our name for what other organizations call the equity lens or the equity tool. We, on purpose, decided not to lead with the equity lens. We wanted to have, we're Metro, we're a planning organization, we love our plans. So we decided to start with this comprehensive plan and include some tools in it, like the racial equity guidance questionnaire. So what went into the creation of this racial equity strategy? A lot of engagement with the community. That's one of the main things that we did. We work with our overall consultants are from the Center for Social Inclusion out of New York City and the Government Alliance for Race and Equity out of the University of California at Berkeley. They work with a number of jurisdictions around the country on racial equity. They're working all along the Atlantic coast, the East Coast, the Midwest, everywhere. There's a lot of interest around the country in this kind of work. And so we hired them because they have that expertise. And one of the things that we were pleased to discover was that they thought that we were really doing a great job involving the community. Because this was really built into from the beginning, it was built into the racial equity strategy. For instance, the work plan that led to this strategy started with creating an advisory committee of community members, a lot of high-profile people that have a vested interest in equity in general. And so they helped us do that. But the most important thing, in my opinion, in that work plan was that they decided to include the creation of a baseline report that would then help us identify the measurements for equity around the region. And Metro has the expertise to do it in-house, absolutely. But they had this was before my time, so I speak about them, not us. But the folks who were there at the time, they had the foresight of bringing community organizations to help create that report. So they did a competitive process, and they selected 6 community-based organizations that had expertise in research, but at the same time they had connections with different communities, especially historically marginalized communities. And Metro and these 6 community-based organizations, we went through a long process to figure out how to create that baseline. The work plan was also very elegant in that it looked at, the idea was there's a number of studies about disparities around the region. Coalition of Communities of Color has a number of studies. The Urban League of Portland has the State of Black Oregon. There's the Greater Portland Polls. There's the Equity Atlas that at the time was under the Coalition for a Livable Future. So the idea was to look at all those indicators and choose the ones that were more amenable to Metro's work. And that seemed really simple and elegant, and of course it didn't work that way, because the communities had based organizations had a strong reaction about that, and thinking, well, you know, these are great indicators for diagnosing the problems, but not really indicators for showing what is Metro's responsibility in this. You can take rates of asthma, that's my favorite example. You know, we Metro have a role in whether those rates of asthma go up and down, which of course those rates of asthma are higher among communities of color. We do transportation planning, so we have a role in that. We have parks, a network of regional parks in natural areas, so we know those help alleviate this condition, but we cannot really pinpoint whether Metro, by doing a specific action or another, was really helping bring that rate up or down. So we knew we needed a different approach, and our community members really had a strong opinion about that. And they were the ones, in the end, what we decided to do was to really allow them to take the driver's seat and write a report from their perspective and use that report as the basis for the equity strategy. And it wasn't a given, you know, it wasn't something that happened easily. There was a lot of conversation about that, but in the end we feel like we made the right decision by empowering community-based organizations to really take that approach. And that helped pave the road for the equity strategy beautifully, because they were the first group to say explicitly to Metro, you should take a racial equities approach. Because they're the ones who were bringing a lot of this information to the forefront about racial disparities and other situations that affect people of color. So, starting with that, you know, we had a really good basis of community engagement and support, but we also know that we government folks don't necessarily have the trust of the community, and that the community is not necessarily going to be as open in sharing their ideas and thoughts with us. So we decided to hire, to do a competitive bidding process and select an organization to help us connect with communities in a different way. And we ended up selecting the proposal from the Multicultural Collaborative, which is a local firm, and they really assembled a group of people from community-based organizations that had the trust of those communities, that had the connections and had really the opportunity to bring the different communities of color and youth together to get the information that we needed. So we ended up having 3 rounds of engagement as part of the process. The first round consisted in the Multicultural Collaborative bringing together community members from 6 different communities of color plus youth to ask, what do you think Metro, well, first of all, what is Metro? We need to explain that. And second, we needed to ask what these community members thought should be included in the equity strategy. And we got a lot of data. All of those conversations were, when appropriate, conducted in the language of the specific groups. It was really interesting. I'm a native Spanish speaker, but I didn't go to the one with Latino folks. I went to the one with the Slavic communities. It was really cool to be in a place where I didn't understand what was going on, except for what our interpreters were relaying to us. So it was really flipped the position, the power dynamics that a lot of times we have in public meetings. So we got a lot of good information from the first round of engagement, and we used that information to formulate our first take on what should be the actions and objectives and goals that we should include in the equity strategy. And we brought that information back to the same community members on the second round of engagement to check with them and make sure that we got it right. We wanted them to see that. And we got, again, a lot of good feedback. We needed to change some things, we needed to add some things, but overall we were, according to the folks who helped us on a good path and we had interpreted things relatively well. So we finalized, once we had the final draft of the strategy, we did the third round of engagement to once again confirm with the communities of color that the strategy was along the lines of the feedback that they had provided. So the other types of engagement, well, I guess I should mention that the 3 things that we heard primarily from all this engagement with communities of color, the 3 main takeaways that we got were, first of all, that we, Metro, needed to have greater accountability to them. They said, Metro is, you guys are trying, you're doing good, but you need to do more. You need to really be accountable, transparent, and open in sharing your struggles and your successes, not just tell us how well you're doing. And you need to create those connections, which is related to the second takeaway, which was create real relationships, build real relationships with communities of color, and not just episodic engagement. They told us very clearly, we're tired of getting people from your teams coming with questions for specific projects and then maybe coming back to tell us what happened with our input and then going away. And so we don't like that episodic engagement. We really want to build long-term relationships with you. With Metro, we want to make sure that you're here with us not just when you need something, but that it's a more equal footing relationship. Which is related to the third takeaway, which was that communities of color really wanted to have more direct access to our decision makers. By the second round, they told us, well, it's great that you guys came back, but what about, we want to talk to your counselors. We want to talk to the decision makers, to somebody that's in a higher position of power. And we heard that, and we invited our counselors, and it was great on both sides, because the communities saw that they could have a direct conversation with their elected representatives, and our council members were delighted to have the opportunity to have that conversation unfiltered in a setting like this. If you can imagine a gathering like this with food, and with just the opportunity for council members to talk about what they are interested in, and for community to respond and to also present their interest to the decision makers. So having that direct access to decision makers, we felt that it was really important and really powerful, and not just for the communities of color. It was, I would say, equally transformative for our elected officials. So, other stakeholder engagement that we did. We of course knew that we needed to prioritize hearing from communities of color, but that didn't need to be the only focus. So we also had regional stakeholder engagement. We leaned on our counselors and on staff to talk to a number of business leaders, nonprofit leaders, people from the philanthropic community and other from other jurisdictions to ask similar questions. What do you think Metro should do to advance racial equity? We touched base with those stakeholders on 2 rounds. We also conducted an electronic survey about a year, in January of this year. We unveiled the survey together with other electronic surveying that we were conducting at the time. We received about 1,200 responses to the survey, and the main findings were that the majority of respondents supported the effort. Only 5% of the respondents disagreed and said, you, Metro, should not be doing this racial equity work. But it was really a small percentage. We were surprised. We thought it would be higher. It was only 5%. The top 3 priorities, which we asked what should be the priority for Metro's equity strategy, was the top one was collaborating more with communities of color, trainings and promoting a racially diverse workforce, and the third priority was to provide more investment opportunities to support small businesses owned by community-based organizations or people of color. So those were the main takeaways. And the third stakeholder group that was key to engage was our own staff, because they're the ones who are going to be implementing this. So we had a couple of rounds of engagement as well with staff. We did also an assessment. We used a tool developed by the Coalition of Communities of Color to assess where Metro is in terms of our own racial equity, and we use all of those inputs to finalize our equity strategy. So where we are right now, So we're in the first year of implementation. So we're doing the pilot plans and projects that I mentioned to you with the 4 departments. We're working on a comprehensive training plan for our staff. That's something that we hear every day, how staff is clamoring for more trainings related to racial equity and diversity and inclusion. We are also focusing as much as we can our investment in equity-related items, and we continue our community and staff involvement, because we know that just as it was key to engage the community in developing the strategy, it's key to maintain that engagement as we enter into the implementation phase. So this is the Q&A time. Sorry I went a little over than I wanted to, but I get excited talking about this. And as we have some minutes for conversation, I will leave this up. If you want to read the equity strategy, you can go to our URL. It's really simple. It's the oregonmetro.gov /equity. You'll find the document and additional information there, and my contact information's there. As you might have heard, we had a flood in the Metro Regional Center over the